Just at the outset, I want to say it's disappointing that neither Minister Coven nor Minister McEntee are here to respond to this debate. I'm sure they have good reason for not being here, but it's important that those of us on this side of the House have an opportunity to get answers to our very legitimate questions in respect of the Brexit agreement. And my view is that on the occasion of these statements on the pre-European Council, where clearly Brexit is going to be a significant issue, that we would have had that opportunity to get responses from the relevant ministers. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. But I'm going to ask the questions nonetheless. And these are essentially the same questions that I raised in October when we had questions or statements on the Brexit agreement. And I made the point at that stage that in the months leading up to that agreement, those of us who are party leaders on this side of the House were facilitated very well by the Taoiseach and his officials in respect of keeping us briefed on all of the developments in respect of a Brexit agreement. But since the agreement was reached, on that occasion there was no briefing at all provided of any consequence to opposition leaders. And since then, there's been no contact at all from the Taoiseach's office. And I think that's really problematic because there are many, many very big questions which are still hanging there unanswered in relation to the implications of the Brexit agreement for Ireland. And, in the 2 years lead up to the Brexit agreement, from Ireland's point of view, the whole emphasis was on the importance of the backstop because, as many people said, on many occasions, there was that circle to be squared. How can you have a situation where Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, are not aligned because the North would no longer be a member of the EU under Brexit, and obviously the whole question of the integrity of the single market was critical. And we were briefed on this on an ongoing basis that it was unthinkable that you would have any border checks on the border between the North and the Republic, and because of all of the implications of that for trade, but most particularly for the Good Friday Agreement and for peace. And the backstop was the insurance policy in that regard. We were also briefed on a regular basis by the Taoiseach telling us about the critical importance of retaining or ensuring the integrity of the single market, and for that reason that was the justification for the backstop. But when it came to the 11th hour in terms of the negotiations, the backstop was dropped very quickly by the government without an explanation of how Ireland's interests could be protected in the absence of the backstop. And we still don't know how that will be achieved. And we're still left with a situation where there's a circle to be squared. How do we ensure that the kind of standards and safeguards which exist in the single market will be upheld in the Republic of Ireland if there is an open border between North and South? And this key question was glossed over when the agreement was announced. And, suddenly after 2 years of saying the backstop was critical, the backstop is dropped and it hasn't been replaced with anything that gives any kind of assurance whatsoever or any kind of confidence that our trade is not going to be affected by this Brexit deal. And we were told that there would be an arrangement put in place, that there would be this special committee that would be set up that would oversee the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But nobody could explain how those special arrangements would work. And I mean, we see particular arrangements in all kinds of circumstances all around the world between two states and where you have a border that needs to be policed. But in those circumstances, it's a border between two different authorities. But the border that the government is talking about, or that Brexit talks about, is a border in the Irish Sea. So, you know, the authorities on both sides are both UK authorities. So where is the incentive or the independent oversight to ensure that there are proper checks in place? And in the absence of those checks, one has to ask, in what way will goods, potentially inferior goods, produced to inferior standards, coming into Great Britain and moving over to Northern Ireland, how can it be assured that those inferior goods, in terms of quality standards and so on, and safety standards, how can it be ensured that they won't come into the Republic of Ireland? And like throughout the negotiations and over the past couple of years, the Taoiseach raised this issue on an ongoing basis, and he referred on one occasion to the fact that a number of other EU states had warned about the fact that unless arrangements were put in place to secure the single market in terms of its borders with the Republic of Ireland, that confidence in Irish products and Irish trade would be impacted, and with the resultant kind of loss of demand or loss of interest in other states trading with the Republic of Ireland. So those concerns of other member states presumably still stand. And, you know, in the absence of explanations from the government on how these arrangements will work, you can kind of wonder about whether or not Ireland's interests have been sacrificed in the rush to do this deal with the United Kingdom. And, you know, I don't say that lightly, but I raise these questions about how we're going to protect the integrity of the single market under the Brexit deal. I raised it with Minister McEntee, and she wasn't able to answer. And she said, you know, those details will be worked out. So I asked who will be doing these checks, and she didn't know. I asked where would the checks be done, and she didn't know. And, you know, it's very hard to have confidence then that Ireland actually is doing okay out of the Brexit agreement. And all of the focus around the time that the agreement was done was that finally, after 2 or 3 years, an agreement had been reached, and then the focus was, is this going to get through the Commons? And then the question was, how will the DUP respond? But in all of that clatter around all of those big issues, at no point did the government address the issue of whether the Brexit agreement is actually helpful to Ireland's interests, and does it protect our interests as a member of the EU? And that question still remains. And we know that in the last few days when Prime Minister Johnston was obviously being economical with the truth yet again in terms of checks, and he denied that there would be any checks required between goods moving between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and he was quickly pulled up on that by Jeremy Corbyn when he produced documents from the UK Treasury, which pointed out that checks would be needed in some cases. And indeed, when that question was put to the Taoiseach on Monday, the Taoiseach said goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland will need to have some checks to ensure that the EU knows what is potentially coming into their market through Northern Ireland. So, this is a critical point. How do we have a system of checks for goods coming from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, which can then move freely into the Republic of Ireland? And, the question there is, it is very much in Ireland's interests that we are seen to have a tight border in relation to the single market. It's in our interest in terms of ensuring confidence is maintained in Irish goods. And yet nobody in government can explain how this critical issue is going to be dealt with. So I don't know if you have answers today. I was hoping that Minister Coven or Minister McEntee would provide some clarity in relation to that. But we're still left in the extraordinary situation where we haven't a clue, and nobody in government, it seems, has a clue about how Brexit, the Brexit agreement will operate in terms of safeguarding the integrity of our trade and our goods that we trade. And that's a very, very, very dangerous situation to be in my view.